Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty specialized, data you probably wouldn't see outside an engineering lab.
That's right. We've got geological reports, some complex visualizations, and interestingly, pages of actual code snippets.
Yeah, the code itself, it defines this invisible underground world.
And our mission today is really to translate that raw code, that simulation language, into, well, geological insight. We're diving deep into assessing the integrity of underground reservoirs.
Specifically for CO2 storage, right?
Exactly. We want to understand how researchers model how do you actually program the physics of rock and fluid to confidently predict safety over such a long time.
Well, the level of detail you need is frankly extraordinary. Get those initial conditions wrong even slightly, and the whole 500-year run is basically useless, pretty much.
Yeah.
So let's start right there, section 1. Defining this underground world, setting the initial stage. Okay, so the code is the absolute foundation here. Every line is defining some physical aspect.
That's it. Job number 1 is defining equal permeability. They label it PRMZ to be just 10% of the horizontal permeability K.
10%, so heavily restricted upwards flow.
It's intentional. It models reality where layers often impede vertical flow, but it's also building in a safety factor. You're discouraging anything, like the injected CO2, from easily moving up towards the surface. It's like programming a digital lid right into the model.
So from the very start, the simulation is biased towards horizontal spreading, away from vertical leaks. Okay,
Yeah.
container defined. Now, the baseline pressure and temperature.
Precisely. And this is where the numbers get, well, intense. Because pressure at depth is all about the weight above. The code calculates what they call the adjusted reservoir pressure.
Using specific densities I saw.
Yeah, very specific. The brine density, that's the salty water already down there, is set at 436 kilograms per cubic meter. But the really key number is the overburden density.
The weight of all the rocks sitting on top.
Exactly. Set here at 2,600 kilograms per cubic meter. That massive weight is what's containing the pressure naturally.
And that 2,600 kilobum rower essentially dictates the maximum safe pressure, doesn't it? If the injection pressure gets close to exceeding that, you risk fracturing the cap rock.
That's the fundamental limit you're working against, and it gets even more detailed. The simulation sets a reference temperature, TREF, at 288 Kelvin.
Okay, and then it introduces this correction factor, 0.0975 bar per meter. But crucially, this factor isn't static. It's adjusted linearly based on temperature changes within the reservoir model itself. Why bother with that level of thermal detail? Isn't pressure mainly mechanical, about the weight?
Well, at these depths and pressures, temperature actually has a noticeable influence. When you inject huge volumes of fluid, you inevitably change the local temperature.
Right, the injected CO2 might be colder or warmer than the formation.
Exactly. And that temperature change affects the density and compressibility of both the brine and the CO2, even if just slightly. So by adjusting that pressure gradient based on temperature,
You get a more accurate starting point.
precisely, your baseline, the initial pressure field they visualize, becomes much closer to reality. Without that thermal correction, your starting pressure is off, and all your subsequent calculations about overpressure are inherently flawed.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this carefully defined static baseline, airtight, as you said. Let's move to section 2. The dynamics of flow, because as soon as fluid starts moving, things aren't static anymore.
Right.
Stage 2 is where customization comes in. Permeability stops being just a simple single value for the whole formation.
It becomes dynamic. Yes, it's adjusted locally based on 3 main things: how much CO2 saturation there is in a given spot, the concentration of carbonates in the rock matrix there, carbonates like limestone components.
You get minerals within the sandstone, and also any pre-existing trends in porosity that are known from geological surveys.
And this is where those custom functions show up in the code. I saw Curry custom and Kerr custom. Relative permeability. Exactly. Relative permeability is key. It governs how easily CO2, which behaves like a gas, G, or the native brine, behaving like water, Curry, can flow when they're both present in the same pore space.
They sort of compete for flow paths.
They do. And the nuance here is how the code adjusts this competition based on rock chemistry. If there's more carbonate material locally, the model changes how readily the gas phase, the CO2, can start to flow.
I saw a calculation for that threshold.
Yeah.
Something like 0.15 plus another factor.
Yeah, 0.15 plus 0.10.2 in one example, where that 0.2 likely represents the carbonate concentration. It's modeling how different parts of the formation, different lithologies, will interact with the CO2 differently as it tries to displace the brine.
So it's accounting for local chemistry affecting the larger scale fluid movement. Okay.
Okay.
And what about making sure the CO2 actually stays put long term? Trapping mechanisms.
That's handled by including something called hysteresis. The code explicitly keeps this set to true. Hysteresis basically means the system has a memory effect.
Like a sponge.
That's a great analogy. You soak a sponge, then let it drain. It never fully drains, right? There's always some residual water trapped inside the sponge structure.
Oh, so the CO2 acts like that residual water. It gets into the pores, maybe pressure drops later, but some of it gets stuck, becomes immobile.
Precisely. That structural or residual trapping, it's a vital safety mechanism.
Yeah.
The CO2 physically adheres to the pore surfaces and won't move easily again.
Okay, so we have pore scale physics, chemistry, but what about bigger potential problems, larger geological features?
Yeah, absolutely critical. You can't just model perfect rock layers. The code specifically requires defining known geological risks, things like mud edifices and mud volcanoes,
Why focus on those specific features?
because they often represent pathways or zones of, let's say, pre-existing weakness or instability. Mud edifices, for instance, are features formed long ago, often with complex internal structures, maybe some natural fractures.
So if the injection builds up pressure,
These are the spots where fluids might find an easier path upwards, potentially bypassing the main caprock seal. Researchers use sophisticated subgrid frameworks for this, often built using other tools like Eclipse 5, to very carefully map these potential weak points.
so the whole point of injecting a lot of fluid, pushing the pressure, is essentially to stress test the system around these known potential flaws.
That's a huge part of it. You need to know if these features compromise the overall storage security under realistic high-pressure conditions.
Right, which leads us perfectly into section 3, the simulation loop itself. We're injecting into this complex dynamic system, managing pressure over centuries. What's the overall time frame here?
Okay, the total simulation time, T, is set for 500 years, but the injection itself, stop-inject, is scheduled to stop after 400 years initially.
So 100 years of just watching what happens after injection stops.
Actually, it's more like 300 years in this specific setup, as we'll see. They use variable time steps too. Starts with small steps, like 2 years, when pressures change rapidly during injection.
Captures the dynamics better.
Yes. Then it increases to maybe 10-year steps later on after injection stops to efficiently model that long, slow migration and residual trapping phase.
And the scale of the operation. It's not trivial.
No, it's significant. The main simulation uses 10 defined well locations, and the starting base rate is 50,000 cubic meters per day, a substantial volume.
Okay, but here's where I saw that tension you mentioned earlier. There's a planned injection schedule based on time, but it seems like it's always under the threat of being overridden by a safety check.
That tension is really the core narrative, isn't it? You have the clock dictating the operational goal, inject this much volume over time, but then you have the pressure acting as the ultimate safety governor. Let's look at the clock-based schedule first.
The dynamic rate changes over time.
Yeah, it's not just a flat rate. From year 50 to 100, they actually reduce the rate to 80% of that base rate, maybe letting the pressure stabilize a bit initially.
Oh.
But then from year 100 to 200, they do the opposite. They ramp it up significantly to 120% of the base rate.
Wow, 120%. They're really pushing it there, aren't they? Stress testing early on.
It certainly looks like it, deliberately increasing the pressure gradient, probably to see how quickly the pressure front moves and how the different parts of the reservoir respond.
And then what happens at 200 years?
Then, interestingly, the code implements a hard stop for injection at the 200-year mark in this run. All wells are removed from the active list. This seems to be a modeling choice, overriding the initial 400-year stop-inject plan.
So they stop injecting much earlier than planned to allow for a longer post-injection monitoring period, 300 years instead of 100.
Exactly. More time dedicated purely to assessing long-term migration and trapping, which is crucial for safety verification. But remember, even this 200-year aggressive schedule might not complete.
Because of the pressure override.
Yeah.
The safety mechanism.
The ultimate brake pedal, yes. The system defines a global limit. It's typically set at something like 90% of the maximum pressure the cap rock can theoretically withstand based on that overburden density we talked about.
90%, so leaving a 10% safety margin.
Correct. And if the mean pressure across the entire simulated field, the code tracks this as mean, if that average pressure value crosses the 90% threshold,
Instant reaction.
immediate trigger. The simulation forces a drastic reduction in injection rate across all active wells.
It's a big cut, isn't it?
Drops straight down to 50% of the base rate. It's the model essentially saying, whoa, too close to the limit, back off everywhere to protect the cap rock. It prioritizes geological integrity over meeting that volume injection target or schedule.
So you've got this race going on inside the simulation. The schedule's trying to ramp up injection, push the volume in, maybe even exceed the base rate, while the pressure monitor is constantly watching, ready to slam on the brakes if the overall system integrity looks threatened. That must create some really interesting results visually. It absolutely does. Which takes us nicely into section 4. Visualizing these results, this is where the raw code and numbers become, actual geological insight via these 3D plots often generated in MATLAB. How do those plots translate all that complex pressure and CO2 movement into something understandable?
Well, the color coding is essentially the language of risk assessment here. You typically see high pressure areas shown in warmer colors, reds, oranges.
Okay.
And those warm colors usually correspond to high saturation levels of mobile CO2. That's the CO2 that's still moving, still contributing significantly to the pressure buildup, and potentially migrating.
And the CO2 that's been successfully trapped, the stuff we want.
That residual CO2, the stuff immobilized by that hysteresis effect we discussed, is usually shown in cooler colors, maybe blues or greens. It's no longer contributing much to pressure or movement.
So by comparing the plots, like the initial pressure field versus the final pressure field after 500 years.
You get a dramatic visual story. You see where the pressure plumes developed, how far the CO2 migrated, where it stabilized, and hopefully where large amounts have become residually trapped in those blue zones. Now, I'm looking at one specific graph here, the per well pressure versus time. This seems to track individual wells, not just the average pressure. Yes, and that's a really critical distinction for practical operations. The global average pressure, that means, might still be well below the 90% safety limit.
But things could be getting dangerous near a specific well.
Exactly. This graph shows the pressure history right at, say, well 1, well 2, well 3. And you can see the pressure climbing sharply, maybe up to around the 80-year mark in the example shown in some reports.
And that sharp climb represents?
That represents the localized pressure buildup around that specific well, reaching its own operational limit, often derived from that same fracture pressure concept. Even if the average pressure is okay, the pressure rate near 1 might be getting too high. So the simulation, or a real-world operator, might have to shut down that specific well long before the global limit is hit, just because of the localized risk right at the injection point.
Precisely. It brings that abstract global pressure limit down to a very concrete operational reality. You might have to manage or even sacrifice individual wells to maintain the safety of the entire storage site.
And throughout all this, they're carefully tracking the total volume injected as well.
Meticulously. You need to confirm that a significant realistic volume of CO2 was actually stored securely, even with these dynamic rate adjustments and potential well shut-ins driven by pressure constraints. It validates the simulation's fidelity.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through quite a process here, from setting those fundamental rock properties, the anisotropic permeability, the densities,
The baseline conditions.
right, then into the dynamic flow, relative permeability, changing with chemistry, the trapping mechanisms like hysteresis.
Accounting for those geological weak spots too. Yes, and then running this, well, quite aggressive 500-year simulation loop, constantly balanced by that crucial pressure safety override.
And finally seeing how visualization turns all that complex data, that tension between injection and safety, into clear, color-coded maps and graphs showing risk and containment.
So this deep dive, it really gives us a shortcut, doesn't it, to understanding the immense engineering challenge here.
It does. It shows that secure CO2 storage isn't just about finding a deep hole and pumping CO2 in. It's about incredibly sophisticated dynamic hydraulic control managed over potentially centuries. It's about managing pressure risk constantly.
And that dynamic control, that constant tension, leads us to a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider.
Okay. The simulation is built with this inherent conflict, an ambitious, even accelerating injection schedule, versus a hard safety limit that forces drastic rate cuts or even early well shut-ins, either locally or globally. The economic goal versus the safety imperative.
Exactly. So if the simulation models consistently show that these pressure limits, either local well limits reached early or the global 90% threshold, force the operation to significantly reduce rates or stop injection long before the planned schedule, say that 200 or 400-year target.
If reality dictates a much slower, more cautious approach than initially planned.
What does that truly imply about the economic viability versus the safety necessities of real-world geological storage projects? Can these ambitious volume targets that make projects look good on paper actually be met if operational safety demands such stringent, potentially costly constraints in practice?